Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Self Pub Sundays. This is episode 11 now, and we are joined by James Lloyd Dulin, author of No Heart for a Thief, book one in the Malitu. Did I say that right, James?
Malitu.
Malitu. Okay, so I spelled it wrong. Malitu series. Welcome, James. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Of course. I am really excited for this conversation. These live shows have gone anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour to over an hour, so you kind of dictate however long you want this to go. Depends on, how long you answer the questions or how
Let's
long
go
we
for
decide
6
to chat.
hours.
All right. So I want to jump in and just start talking about your writing career first, while folks kind of trickle in. And so have you always wanted to be a writer, or when was the first time that you realized this is what I want to do?
So I never really thought of writing as a career or an aspiration. I kind of got I got into writing a lot more in college when I started doing a lot of poetry. It was it was the first time in my life I had access to HBO, and in the residence hall we had deaf poetry on HBO, and I got really into it. Like I got the DVDs and everything, and so I got really into writing poetry, and then I started getting into slam, and I kind of did that off and on for a while, and then eventually I like really committed to writing poetry. I put together a couple of chapbooks. I was on a team that went to the National Poetry Slam. I did competitions, in pretty big venues. And so like that was kind of where I was at. And then throughout that process, I always enjoyed reading fantasy. And so I was like, I want to try to do this. Um, and so that kind of bled into to wanting to write this book. And I took some inspiration from books that I loved, like really Name of the Wind was the first book that really showed me that you could blend this poetic language into a fantasy story and have it like really be impactful. And so that was where that itch came from. Like, I want to try to do that. And there are definitely some inspirations in No Heart for a Thief that you can probably tell in terms of structure that come from my love of Name of the Wind.
Well, it's funny that you mention inspirations, because my next question for you is, who are your writing heroes? I like to call them writing heroes. Other people call them inspirations. And you mentioned Name of the Wind, which is funny because this is the 11th episode that we have for Self Pub Sundays. And at least half of these episodes I've done, Name of the Wind has been mentioned as one of the inspirations. But do you have any other writing heroes or inspirations that you use?
Yes. So I would say Name of the Wind was definitely an early on writing hero or inspiration. I would say beyond Patrick Rothfuss, Robin Hobb is a huge one. N.K. Jemisin. Like I love writers that have just such a respect for the craft and can really put together a story that where the writing is as engrossing as the story itself. And so that really kind of makes makes those people stand out more for me.
I think you've gotten a new fan out of Leslie.
I see that. Is Leslie our one person holding it down right now?
Leslie's my bestie, and she shows up for just about everything.
Oh, she has a great YouTube channel. So if
She has a great YouTube. Yeah, her channel is
yeah.
fantastic. Um, all right. Well, we're gonna talk about spoiler free for No Heart for a Thief. Um,
Yeah.
so, speaking of spoiler free, so James, can you give us your elevator pitch for No Heart for a Thief?
Yeah.
It could be a long
I
elevator ride too.
it is. I'll try to do the shortest one I can. So it's about this man who has ostracized himself from the world after starting starting a war to fight back for his land after it has been colonized by a foreign empire. And so he's ostracized himself from this war he abandoned, and he's kind of pulled back into it when this young girl is runs through his area in his little hideout of the world, and he saves her from a couple of the imperial soldiers. And so he's pulled back into it because she's bent on revenge, and she reminds him a lot of himself at that age. And he thinks by trying to share his story and the lessons that he's learned and the hardships he's gone through, that he can convince her not to make the same mistakes that he made. And so it's a story told in two timelines. There's the timeline of him, Kalo and Tayan in the present, kind of working together, training together. And then there's the story of Kalo telling his story to Tayan, which actually in book one is a majority of the story.
Great. Yes, Leslie, you will love this book. Leslie and I have very similar reading tastes. So I know when she loves a book, I'll love it. And when I love a book, she's going to love it. And I absolutely loved No Heart for a Thief. So
Well, that's
you
great to
can't
hear.
convince a woman to leave off from revenge.
That is the difficulty of the whole book. Yes.
Yes. So, what makes No Heart for a Thief or your Malatu series different from other fantasy series?
Um, I think a lot of fantasy series buy into a lot of similar tropes. I think one thing that does set No Heart for a Thief apart from a lot of fantasy is it's not focused on kings, queens, commanders. It's not focused on anybody who has power in the society. It's focused on people who are being ostracized and oppressed by this society. And so they're really there's no attention given to those people with power because their stories told easily, and so I wanted to really focus in on the characters that just have to kind of survive the onslaught of what is going around them and going on around them.
Yeah. When I was reading No Heart for a Thief, I was reminded of another book that I read for Self Pub Sundays, The Bleeding Stone by
Okay.
Joseph John Lee. That one, just like No Heart for a Thief, deals with the theme of colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
Lee deals specifically with the U.S. colonialism
Mm-hmm.
and then indigenous tribes. But when there's a certain part in No Heart for a Thief, and I can talk about it a little further once we get into spoilers.
Yeah.
But there's a certain part in your book that was very reminiscent of his book.
Oh, really?
And it was like, I would love to get like you two together in a conversation to talk about this. Because I know you wrote in your afterword of the book that you didn't set out to tell any one particular story, but it was very reminiscent of the Bleeding Stone story and of just indigenous stories. that I've heard throughout time.
Hmm.
Um, you can't tell because my skin is so white. I have very, very little bit of Native American in me,
Hmm.
and my grandma was like 1/16 Cherokee, I think, and she was like very proud of that statistic. And I grew up with a whole bunch of stories of the Cherokee and Native Americans, and so kind of reminded me of those stories that I grew up with.
Interesting.
Um, so speaking of stories, stories are hugely important in No Heart for a Thief.
Yeah.
Um, there's a line that says this: "We are the stories that we tell," or that's paraphrased,
Yeah.
but that's the main gist of it. And it reminds me of a nonfiction collection of essays that Leslie and I are actually buddy reading together. It's a collection by Joan Didion. And the title of that collection is "We Tell Ourselves Stories in Order to Live." And I was wondering where you got the idea of this story from. Where did this story come from?
It came from a lot of different places. It started with the magic system, and things kind of built around that. I I was walking my dog and just thinking about random things as you do when you're lost in your head. And I love the concept of sin eaters. So these beings who can literally consume somebody's sin. And I thought about the idea of somebody being able to consume magic. And that's kind of where in the book there's this ability to steal magic, which is an essential part of the story. Um, and so I really loved that idea of being able to consume magic. And then that built around like, okay, what kind of magic are they consuming and all of that. And then the idea for the plot of it really came from me wanting to tell a story that had meaning to me. I wanted to tell something that was, I'm very politically minded, and I didn't want to write anything that wasn't going to feel authentic. And so I wanted to, I didn't want to engage with any one specific culture because I didn't want to tell any native stories or any oppressed group stories that weren't my own. But I wanted to engage with this idea of colonialism and whiteness um, as a kind of a force that impacts people around the world, and kind of look at that from a a point of view where it doesn't center white people in the story. And so it kind of all just wrapped around each other. And I tell you, the first version of the story looks nothing like where it ended up. As a first time writer, I've been through so many drafts of this story. At one point, it had like kind of voicey footnotes throughout. Um, that didn't really work, but a lot of it ended back in and got reworked.
Yeah. One of my MFA professors said that the magic of the writing comes in through the editing. Your first draft is just like word vomiting. You're just getting it
Yes.
out on the page. And then the magic comes from when you start to sculpt it together into the real story that you want to tell.
Yeah. Although
Um,
I will say the word vomit looks a lot prettier after you have a little bit more experience. Um, I know that first time around, I was head hopping left and right. I like it was a mess.
yeah.
But I think it eventually I know it eventually became something that I'm very proud of. So I'm glad we're.
Well, you should be proud of it. Um, my worst thing in my first drafts was jumping tenses.
Mm,
I would go from different tenses within like one sentence would be in past tense and the next sentence would be in present tense, and I
yeah.
wrote nonfiction.
Yeah, that can be difficult. And if you're about to read No Heart for a Thief, get prepared because you're going to jump from third person to first person, depending on if we're in the present or the past. And so there was a lot of that too, because I was trying something that in some ways is a little bit higher of a bar than probably I should have taken on as a debut novelist. Because there's a lot of jumping perspectives and timelines and all of that.
But I think you, from the reader's perspective, you did a really great job with that because there wasn't, except for the very first time it happened when I wasn't expecting it. After that, it didn't jar me at all. It was a smooth transition every time you jumped perspectives and timelines, and most of the major jumps happen between chapters. It's not
Yeah,
within one chapter you have these big jumps. Most of the big jumps happen from chapter to chapter, and I feel like you've done a much better job at that than some writers I've done. So
I
don't sell
appreciate that.
yourself short. It is something to look for if you're not used to that in a book.
Yeah,
But I don't think it didn't hinder my reading one bit. So
that's good to
um,
hear.
so we talked about where the story came from. We talked about the magic system,
Mm-hmm.
which I absolutely love.
Oh,
That's
thank
one
you.
of my favorite parts of the book. Um, so here's my chicken or the egg question
Mm-hmm.
for you. Which came first in when you started writing No Heart for a Thief? Your characters or your story?
The story, um, which is interesting because it is such a character-driven um, story, and the plot is, it's there, but it's minimal at times. It's
Yeah.
really focused on, these two main characters and Kalo for the most part. But and I'd say they were there at the conception of it, uh, um, but character work was not my best in my first draft. I was just trying to get things together, and then I looked back at it. I'm like, I need to really define who these people are and what they're going through and build more of that in. And so I would say that it became more of a character focused piece after a lot of editing.
That's
Um,
really surprising because your characters are absolutely fantastic.
I appreciate that. I
Um,
put a lot of work into them to try to get them there.
I mean, Kalo and the main characters that we have in this book are incredible, but also, I'm a side character
Yeah.
reader. I always gravitate to our side characters more than our main character, and your side characters held the story up. Um, I feel like we could have, split offs just on some of the side characters that we get in
Yeah.
this.
I,
Um,
it's interesting because one of my favorite character from book one is definitely Nyx, and she doesn't get much time in the book. I think she's in maybe 3 or 4 chapters.
mhm.
She does get a POV in book two though, so spoiler. Um, but I love Nyx, and so she was. I just enjoyed writing her.
Let's see. So, um, you must be reading my mind or have like a secret camera reading my notes because literally my next question is part of our spoiler chat. So, Leslie, you haven't read this book, and I know how you feel about spoilers. So, go let me know when you're going to read this book because I'll reread it with you. Go read it and then come back and watch the rest of this chat. And same thing for anyone out there who hasn't read No Heart for a Thief yet. We're going into spoilers now, so you're going to be spoiled about the book. Um, so if you don't want to be spoiled, go read the book and come back and watch the rest of the chat. You definitely should read No Heart for a Thief because it's well worth the read. And it's a relatively short book for fantasy books. So go read it and then come back and watch this.
Which was odd to me because I felt like I was writing a very long book.
So now we're into our spoiler chats, and you were talking about Nyx
Hmm.
being your favorite character. And my next question was, who's your favorite or the easiest character to write? So do you have a character that was just like super easy to write?
I think Kalo came the most effortlessly to me because I imbued him with a lot of my own insecurities.
Hmm.
Um, Kalo's main question, main internal question throughout book one is about how to define himself when he learns that he is a spirit thief. How to see himself, because he's been inundated with these narratives about what spirit thieves are, and so that that perception of what a spirit thief is just changes how he sees himself so drastically. Um, and I think that idea of stories that come from other people and other perspectives about who we are become who we are in some ways if we adopt them. And so that piece of him just it was easy to write because it's something that I have struggled with in my life. And so he was the most closely related to me, I think. So he
Mm.
was easy to write in that way. Although Wall is very fun to write because he's very sarcastic and I can be very sarcastic, so that came off pretty easy as well.
So on the flip side of things, who was the hardest character to write?
I think Tan was the hardest to get right.
Okay.
Um, Especially at the beginning. You have this 14-year-old girl who has just lost her entire family and gone through this very traumatic moment of almost dying, saved by a stranger, and then for the plot, I knew she had to decide to stay.
Yeah.
But the idea that this 14-year-old girl would decide to stay with a stranger that she just saw kill two people, even if it was to save her, like at first it was like way too easy. It's like,
Huh.
yeah, I'm staying
Right.
after that major trauma. And then in a later draft, it just like there was a whole nother chapter of her like arguing with her internal struggle of staying or not. And so finding a balance of her angst, her her survivor's guilt, her and I would say she doesn't even have a keen desire for vengeance. She thinks that's what she's supposed to have.
Right.
She internalizes that idea of she owes her family something and it should be vengeance. But I don't think she really understands what vengeance is.
Yeah.
I don't think she really understands how to deal with her own guilt for not dying with her family. And so it all just turns into this focus on this is an answer. Revenge is an answer. So I'm going to focus my energy on that. And
Right.
so I didn't want her to come off as like bloodthirsty, because she's not. She's just an extremely traumatized child.
Yeah.
But I also didn't want her to come off as weak and and aimless.
Yeah.
So finding the balance with Tan was difficult.
Yeah. I think you found the right balance.
I appreciate that.
To me, she wanted vengeance and revenge because that was what she thought she was supposed to do.
Hmm.
Um, but she was also completely lost in the world and didn't know. This was the first time that she's been away from her family.
Yeah.
And to stumble upon her family all killed and piled together in their house will give you all sorts of traumas,
Hmm.
especially at 14. So I feel like the balance was definitely there. She never felt bloodthirsty to me. She felt, especially at the beginning before we really got to know her, she felt like, okay, this is a girl out for revenge because because of her family.
Hmm.
But then as you got to know her, you realized that's not really what she wants. That's just what she thinks she should be doing right now because she doesn't know anything else
Yeah,
besides that. So I feel like you found a good balance for her.
I appreciate it. She was very hard to write. I definitely got some feedback from, especially from some of my beta readers who were women who were like, so she's very trusting of this man who she's never met, who's in a very like position of power, and like she wakes up in a strange place, and she's very trusting way too quick. And so I tried to deal with that because it's a really valid criticism. And so I
Yeah,
tried to hopefully make that distrust show a little bit more and take a little bit more time to ease.
yeah. But also, she's alone in the world, and
Yeah.
there's this guy that just saved her from these two soldiers, these two men. And so if she's got to have anyone to trust at this point, it's going to be him because
Yeah.
she knows she can't make it on her own. She won't survive without him, so she almost has to trust him.
Yeah.
Um, so earlier I referenced a scene
Hmm.
that reminded me of a different book, and so now we're moving into the discussion about scenes. And so the scene that I was talking about was towards the end when they go to rescue the sister from the
Hmm.
camp, from the mission school, if you will. And there is a very similar scene in The Bleeding Stone where our main character um, is going to help a friend who was basically like, well, she would, let me think before I speak. I think her her friend was going with her to rescue her brother, who was
Okay.
in one of these camps, essentially. And as soon as you wrote we're going to this mission school, my mind was like, okay, we're going into this kind of world now. Um, Up until then, it felt like a very generalized colonialism type of story.
Hmm.
But when the mission schools were brought in, I knew exactly what kind of world we were in. It felt like with the spirits and the magic system, it felt like an indigenous type of world.
Hmm.
Um, and that, mission school scene or scenes, really, because it was more than just one,
Yeah.
kind of brought it home, saying like this is exactly the kind of story that we're in. Um, and though that sequence of scenes were some of my favorite scenes because it really brought the story together and kind of rounded out the story for me. Um, so uh, I was wondering what your favorite scene is in No Heart for a Thief.
Um, I guess the one that immediately jumps to mind is chapter more than a scene. It is the chapter in which it's in the present, in which there is a scout on the surrounding area of the Soon, and Nix comes to get Kalo to try to see if there's actually danger in the woods. Um, and what I really loved about this chapter was one, it was our we got to see a little bit more of who Nyx was,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of her leadership qualities, but also her kind of her tough exterior and all of that. You got to see a little bit of kind of Kalo engaging with somebody outside of Tayan and Nyx. Like Kalo's interactions in the present are very contained to a few people.
Yeah.
And so I liked his interactions with Doc, and learning that Nyx is um, what is essentially trans in this story. They're Kamani people. The idea of their spirit is not attached to any one gender,
Mm-hmm.
um, and and so that reveal, but also learning a little bit more of how the ideals and ideas of this colonialist nation have kind of infected young people in a way that they're detached from, their culture and who they used to be and how they used to respect people. So I really loved that, and then I loved the ending of that chapter in which Tayan finally has this one-on-one with Nyx, and Nyx is expecting her to ask about Nyx being Kamani.
Yeah.
And instead, Tayan is like, what is it like to kill a person?
Yeah.
Because Tayan's been through that once. And that scene of just like, oh, this is not what I thought this conversation was going to be. And then this very honest, almost too adult response from Nyx of like, the second time is going to be your worst.
Right.
Um, and then kind of the throwaway at the end of like, so do you want me to call you they them? And she's like, no, she's good. And that's the extent of that conversation. Um, so I loved the flow of that chapter, and I loved getting to know more of Nyx in that chapter.
Yeah, it really shows a lot about both Nyx and Tayan
Yeah.
in that conversation. And, it shows up until then, Nyx has been this hard exterior character. And it let us just dip into her softer side just a little bit,
Hmm.
and shows that she's just like any of the other fighters out there, that
Yeah.
this does affect her. After time, you get used to it and it doesn't affect you as much, but she's just like everyone else in killing people.
Yeah.
She's not immune to it.
The softer side of her while she's talking about murder.
I mean,
It's
it's
yeah.
funny because while I was reading No Heart for a Thief, um, a couple days ago, me and my partner watched the Dungeons and Dragons movie.
Oh yeah.
And so when I got to Nyx's character, the image that I had in my brain was our main female character from Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
I think Michelle Rodriguez
Yeah.
plays her, and that was like, it was like we had watched that movie, and then I got to the Nyx part like the next day, so that image was like in my head, and now Nyx will forever be Michelle Rodriguez in my head.
That's not a bad fan casting. I think she could do that part pretty well.
So we talked about your favorite scene.
Hmm.
Do you have a least favorite scene, or what was the hardest scene to write?
I think the hardest just section of the book was, um, we Kalo leaves his home. He has left his parents behind to, assumed death. Um, and he wakes up in the middle of nowhere, not really understanding what's going on. And it's a very essential transition point for him in the story. But he's alone in the middle of a forest with nothing to bounce off. And so it is 100% him interacting with the physical world and his inner monologue. Um, and so that was a difficult scene to kind of feel like I'm moving it somewhere
Mhm.
and getting enough out of it where it doesn't just feel like they're, any other walking scene. And so that was, I think, the most difficult section of the book to write. Um, and just kind of get at some of that internalized angst, that confusion, that guilt, all of that kind of stuff, while also having no one to talk to. The only interaction is with the trees and the soil and all of that. And so that was a harder section to write.
So, James, what do you want your readers to come away with after they finish reading No Heart for a Thief?
I think that's hard. I'm of the perspective that readers get to decide what they've read. Um, and, you know, after I've published a book, I'm just a really knowledgeable reader more than anything else. I don't have the ability to claim the story is something that a reader doesn't see in it. Um, and so it's a difficult question to answer from that perspective. I would say what I take from it is, um, there's the allegory of whiteness in it and the idea of consumption and taking and colonialism all in there. And I think that's important to take away. Um, but I don't think I'm necessarily saying anything new about colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
I think the point is to understand the toll it has on just average people, and this idea of, you know, they're losing their culture, they're losing their ties to community. I think at one point Tan says something to the effect of, it's not that if tomorrow came and the Gausht were sent away from the land, her life still wouldn't be the life she was supposed to have.
Yeah.
She was supposed to grow up in a community around her people and learn about her people in that space.
Right.
So even if they left tomorrow, they have taken away what her life was supposed to be. And so to me, I think that's the thing to focus on. It's not just that there's this outside force, it's that internalized thing of, I have to mourn something while trying to survive it. But again, I think people can take away a lot of different things from it.
Yeah. So, if I remember correctly, you've entered No Heart for a Thief into SPFBO. Yeah, yes.
Yes.
That competition.
SPFBO.
SPFBO, yes. It's a lot easier to say the acronym than to try to spell it out. How do you feel about it? Are you excited? Are you nervous?
Yes. It's a difficult thing to kind of navigate. I'm trying not to think about it too much, because the idea is you need to take advantage of the extra attention brought to books within SPFBO, and you need to try to engage in that. But at the same time, I don't want to be stalking the reviewer's page and trying to reload that all the time and worry about who's getting cut and who's not.
Right.
I'm trying not to engage with that competition so much, because at this point there's nothing I can do. Like, it's not a competition where I can go out and play harder. The work's been done, so hopefully it goes well. I can't control the types of books that my assigned blog will like. They might really like character-driven fantasy that's really contained and not extremely plot heavy. They might like that. A lot of people do. A lot of people don't. They want something that's more action-packed.
Right.
And there's a lot of action scenes, but I wouldn't say that it's an action-driven book.
Yeah.
And so they may or may not like it, and I can't control that, so I'm trying not to obsess about it.
Yeah.
So it's difficult. I don't know if that's a coherent answer.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. You say you're trying not to think about it as I bring it up.
Yes. No, I mean, it comes up. I don't mind talking about it. I don't mind thinking about it. I try not to think about the results.
Right. The bottom line is more people are going to read No Heart for a Thief. Even if worse comes to worse, you're cut in the first round. Yeah. Those are still going to be readers that read it in the first round that you wouldn't have had if you didn't enter it in. But I'm sure because it's such a great book, it'll make it far.
I hope so. That would be nice.
I hope so too. I think this is a book that will hit a lot of people in a good way, will resonate with a lot of people. And I just, like I mentioned before we went live, I just finished it last night,
Hmm.
and my brain has been thinking about it ever since I finished it. And I go back and forth on, the star ratings of it.
Hmm.
Um, I usually do my star ratings on like Goodreads and Storygraph as soon as I finish the book, because that's my most clear thoughts when I finish it. So when I finished it last night, I gave it 4 stars out of 5 stars. And um, this is totally different than any of the other episodes that I've done, because I usually don't talk about
Yeah.
my ratings, but I there is a point to all of this rambling. Um,
Okay. Yeah.
I tend to ramble a lot when I'm trying to find the right words,
You're
and
talking through it. That's okay.
eventually I'll get there. So I gave it 4 out of 5 stars when I first finished it, because it was a little bit slower paced than what I'm used to.
Hmm.
And our main character was a little bit down on himself, kind
Hmm.
of, let me just, get out of the picture and make everyone else, and although I resonated with that, and, I could relate to that 100%, because that's how I was a good part of my life. I wanted a little bit more of a redemption arc for him by
Hmm.
the end of the book than we got. But I also feel like, and this is where I'm getting around to my rambling point, I feel like I would benefit 100 times more from a reread
Yeah.
of this book. This is one of those books that feels like the more times you read it, the more you get out of it. Because it is so character focused, and there's so many different characters in it going on that are important to the story. I feel like each time you read it, you're going to focus on a different character, or at least I am, because that's how I do
Yeah.
rereads. And the more times I read it, the more fuller the story will be, because you'll focus on different characters. Um, so sorry about all of my rambling.
No, it's okay. I think the woe is me aspect of Kalo is difficult, right? Because um it can feel like a lot at times, I think. And I would say his arc in the present is more of a trilogy arc than it is a individual story arc. His arc in the past is a little bit more confined to books,
Right.
individual books. But that's his main character flaw. And it's not that he's down on himself. He interacts with the world as if he's the most important part of it. And so he thinks that his guilt is earned because he takes on the responsibility of everything around him.
Yeah.
And so no matter what is happening, if something bad is happening around him, Kayla's going to find a way to blame himself.
Yeah.
And that is his biggest character flaw. He doesn't know how to put things in perspective, give himself forgiveness, or give himself a chance.
Yeah.
Which is why I think one of the interesting thing is, so the spirits all having kind of their own purpose, their own essential quality. One of his spirit ancestors is the seed, who's all about forgiveness, and Kalo can't engage in that. He can't engage in that to forgive himself or the thief.
Mhm.
And so I
Yeah.
get how that can be irritating to some people.
Right.
Yeah.
It didn't stop me from enjoying the book.
Hmm.
Um, it just felt like I wanted more from him.
Yeah.
But also, with the stories that he's been surrounded by, um, the thief has been the negative spirit. The thief has been the one that was at the fault of everything bad that's ever happened.
Yeah.
And so he can't help but blame himself because he's the embodiment of the thief. And so if he's the thief and there's bad stuff happening, then in his mind, obviously, it's his fault because, when they play the ruins game, the one piece that's missing from that game is the thief.
Yeah.
And so, I understood what was happening with the character, and I
Hmm.
still really loved the character.
Yeah.
Um, and now that you say that it's a trilogy arc, that makes more sense.
Yeah.
Um,
And it's difficult because there's valid criticism there to be had in terms of liking or not liking a character. Um, and I can't, I'm not upset if anybody feels like they dislike Kalo or somebody. I just hope they feel real. And so
Absolutely.
you can definitely dislike a real person. And there, if somebody doesn't dislike Kalo, he's definitely not real because everybody dislikes somebody. So I hope that he's dynamic enough to feel real enough to dislike,
Yeah,
if that makes any
absolutely.
sense.
So once again, you're reading my mind on my questions.
Okay.
And you mentioned, that Kayla's arc is a trilogy arc,
Hmm.
which leads me to ask, so what's more for this series? What do you have planned for this series?
Well, this is a trilogy. It's been a planned trilogy since its offshoot. And we're pretty much picking off exactly where we started in the present. Spoilers, of course. They are being hauled off to the Lost Nation, and that's where we pick up. They're right on the entryway or the final steps of going into the Lost Forest as we start book two. Um, there's more of a balance between stories. So the first book is heavily in the past. You know, I wanted that to be the foundation story of book one.
Yeah.
And then as we progress in the trilogy, it becomes more and more about the present and more about Tan.
Yeah.
So it's more of a handoff story to it's Kalo's story in book one. Book two is fairly even. Book three is going to be even more Tan, and so that is kind of the arc of who becomes the most important character.
Right.
Um, and book two can get a little dark at times. I think book one can get a little dark at times. I think
Yeah,
book two
absolutely.
even more so. Tan goes through some stuff in book two.
Okay.
Um, I think it's really interesting. I think people will have a lot of interesting things to say about what the Lost Nation is like. Um, because there's some weird things going on. We meet another one of my favorite characters in book two, who happens to be a poet.
Okay.
And I think this is a fantasy trope that I just love is like those characters that seem to know a lot, but they also speak in, riddle almost. And so
Yeah.
that's this character. Um, and then you get some answers about why Kalo has been given the moniker of the hero of Annalise
Mhm.
in book two. And then book three, I am about 8 chapters into writing that right now. But it's all outlined and planned. Um, and we get to see, some big things happening in the present. And we also get to find out why Kalo is isolated at the beginning of book one. And so it does have that full circle kind of trajectory. I really like the dynamic between past and present because you get to see like there's inherent questions of what happened to get this person in the past to become this person in the present.
Right.
I think one of the biggest questions at the end of book one is how did Wall get to be the person that he's at the end of book two, at the end of
Yeah.
book one? and so you get to engage with him a lot more in book two as
Okay.
well. Um, so I think book two is even better than book one. I still love
Awesome.
book one, but there's a lot more room to kind of play with the characters and go more in depth. There's, you know, book there's a large section of book one where there are only two characters on the page at a time. Like Tayan and Kalo are isolated for most of the book. Kalo is isolated on his own for a lot of the book, or only
Right.
with Jonik, or only with Liara. And so there's a lot of like pair dynamics in book one, where
Mhm.
there's more group dynamics in book two.
Okay.
Um, so I think there are some fun things going on in book two. I'm excited to see what people think about it. Um, I'm kind of excited. I was just telling you before I think we started recording that I'm supposed to get it back from the
Yeah.
copywriter today, the copy editor today. And so I'm really excited to see what she has to say about it.
Well, I think based on what you said about book two, I feel like where you left off on book one leads us straight into there.
Yeah.
I mean, we basically have Kalo giving up the rings to Tayan at the end and saying, all throughout book one, they were fighting their way through. And then at the end, he stopped fighting.
Yeah.
And it definitely felt like that, momentum shift. Like, this is kind of the end of my story, and now it's time for you to pick it up and, tell your story about it. So I'm really excited for book two. I'm looking forward to
No, I'm excited to hear what you have to think about it, what you have to say about it.
that. Well, those are all the questions that I had for you, James. Is there
Okay.
anything that you wanted to discuss that we haven't touched on?
Um, I don't know. I'm excited for readers to get engaged with this series. Um, if you're interested in picking up a signed copy, I have some signed copies on my website. I'm really excited because the Broken Binding is doing a signed and numbered edition run, and so those should be available soon-ish. I'm not sure exactly when they're going to go for sale, but I'm excited for that because I love the Broken Binding.
They're great.
They're not special editions or anything because those special editions are beautiful.
Yeah,
But they are signed and numbered, so that's really cool.
that's great.
But in general, I'm excited to see. I'm always excited to engage with readers. So if you're interested in the book, I hope you read it. Throw me a line if you like it. You know, I hope you enjoy it. That's all I got.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us, James. Um, for anyone out there watching, join us next time. June 25th will be our next episode of Self Pub Sunday, and we're going to be joined by Michael Roberti, and
Oh,
I'm
great.
really excited to talk about his series. So, again, James, thank you for joining me today. It was a great conversation. I had a ton of fun, and to everyone out there who has joined us or is watching this back later, thank you for watching. Thank you for joining us. And if you haven't read No Heart for a Thief yet, definitely need to go read it. Hope you all have a fantastic night, and we'll see you all soon.